On the morning of November 3rd, 1902, at exactly 10:15 a.m., the church bells in a small village near Somerset, England, began to ring slowly, each heavy note echoing through the cold autumn air as people gathered in silence outside St. Matthew's Church, dressed in black, their faces lowered in quiet respect. But their eyes, almost all of them, kept drifting toward one person. She stood near the front, beside the polished wooden coffin, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture calm, her expression still, and in a moment where grief was expected, where tears were almost required, she did not cry. Not once. Not when the coffin was carried in. Not when the priest spoke his final words. Not even when the lid was lowered into the ground. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and by the end of that morning the entire village had begun to whisper the same question in low, uncertain voices. What kind of wife buries her husband without shedding a single tear? The rain had started, lightly just before the service ended, a thin, steady drizzle that clung to coats and hats, turning the soil near the grave into dark, heavy earth. People lingered in small groups, speaking softly, glancing again and again toward Eleanor as if trying to understand something that refused to make sense. Mrs. Hargreaves, who had known Eleanor for nearly 20 years, leaned closer to another woman and murmured, "I watched her the entire time. Not a single tear, not even when they closed the coffin." The other woman nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Some people grieve differently, but even she did not sound convinced. Eleanor remained where she was long after most had stepped away, her gaze fixed not on the grave, but somewhere beyond it, as though her thoughts were not present in that moment at all. A man approached her gently, placing a hand on his hat out of respect. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, "if you need anything." She turned her head, slightly, offering a faint, polite nod. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady, controlled, untouched by the tremor that grief usually brings. The man hesitated for a second longer than necessary, then stepped back, clearly unsettled by something he could not explain. By midday, the whispers had spread through nearly every corner of the village. In small kitchens, along narrow paths, near shop counters, people spoke of Eleanor not with sympathy, but with quiet confusion. Some said she was in shock. Others suggested something colder, that perhaps she had never truly cared for her husband at all, but no one said anything directly to her. No one ever did. Her husband, Richard Whitmore, had been buried that morning after what was described as a sudden illness. He was 42 years old, a man known for his order, his discipline, and his strict adherence to routine. He had worked as a local land manager, overseeing properties that did not belong to him but were treated as though they did. People respected him, though few would say they liked him. He was not cruel in the obvious sense. He did not shout in public, did not cause scenes, but there was something in the way he carried himself, something rigid and unyielding that made others careful around him. Eleanor had married him in the spring of 1880, at the age of 21. She had been quiet even then, but not like this. There had once been a softness to her, a warmth that people remembered in fragments. Mrs. Hargreaves would later say, "She used to smile. Not often, but when she did, it felt real." That version of Eleanor, however, had not been seen in many years. In the weeks following the funeral, Eleanor returned to her routine with a precision that many found unsettling. She rose at the same time each morning, opened the curtains, prepared her meals, and walked through the village at nearly the same hour each afternoon. There were no visible signs of mourning beyond the black clothing she wore, no long periods of isolation, no emotional outbursts, no visible grief. And that was what disturbed people the most. One afternoon, just 6 days after the funeral, Mrs. Hargreaves stopped her gently near the market road. "Eleanor," she said, her voice cautious, "you mustn't carry everything alone. It's not right." Eleanor paused, turning to face her. "I am not carrying anything," she replied calmly. "Everything is as it should be." The words were simple, but there was something in the way she said them, something final, that left no room for further conversation. But not everyone accepted things as they appeared. A young man named Daniel Reeves, who had occasionally worked under Richard Whitmore, began to speak quietly about certain things he had noticed in the weeks before Richard's death. "He wasn't ill," Daniel said one evening in the local shop, his voice low but certain. "Not the way they're saying. He was tired, yes, but not dying." Another man frowned. "Doctors said it was his heart." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Maybe, but something felt wrong." These small doubts began to gather, slowly, carefully, like pieces of something incomplete. Then came the detail that no one could ignore. On October 31st, just 3 days before his death, Richard Whitmore had been seen arguing with Eleanor outside their home at approximately 8:20 p.m. The argument was not loud, but it was intense enough to draw attention. A passing neighbor later described it as quiet but sharp, like something was about to break. No one knew what was said, but they remembered the look on Eleanor's face. Not fear, not anger, but something far more difficult to define. After Richard's death, as his belongings were sorted and his papers reviewed, there was nothing unusual at first. No sign of struggle, no evidence of wrongdoing. Everything appeared orderly, as one would expect from a man like him, but Eleanor's behavior did not change. Weeks passed, then months, and still she did not cry. It was not until the following spring, nearly 5 months later, that something shifted. A distant relative arrived to assist with final estate matters, and in the process of clearing an old storage room, they noticed a small detail. Medication bottles, several of them, neatly arranged but labeled in a way that suggested irregular use. A local doctor was consulted. Questions were asked, quietly, carefully. Nothing was proven, nothing was confirmed. But the idea began to take shape, not as a fact, but as a possibility, that Richard Whitmore's death may not have been as natural as it seemed. And Eleanor had known. Or perhaps she had endured something no one else had seen. No accusation was ever made, no charge was ever filed, and no confession was ever given. Eleanor Whitmore lived the rest of her life in that same house, following the same routines, speaking little and never once explaining herself. She died in the winter of 1926 at the age of 67 and was buried quietly, without attention, without whispers. But even then, people remembered, not her words, not her actions, but that moment, that funeral, that silence, and the question that never left. What kind of truth leaves a person unable to cry? And now, I want to ask you something. Do you believe Eleanor Whitmore was hiding something? Or do you think her silence was the result of something far deeper than guilt? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this make you question what people choose not to say, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for the next story.